Let us cast our minds back to the crisp autumn air of Paris in early October 2025, where Avenue Montaigne was transformed into what was entirely designed to be a masterclass in global rebranding. Meghan Markle stepped from the darkened interior of a chauffeur-driven luxury SUV, wrapped in custom couture, projecting an aura of absolute, unwavering confidence that was meant to signal a triumphant return to the uppermost echelons of high society. Every flash of the paparazzi's cameras, every seemingly candid smile, was a meticulously choreographed stratagem orchestrated to broadcast an image of modern grace and untouchable humanitarian glamour to a watching world. Yet beneath this highly polished veneer, the atmosphere was thick with a rather desperate pressure, an unspoken mandate to reclaim the spotlight, particularly at a time when Prince William was naturally commanding widespread positive global attention through his genuinely impactful charitable engagements. One can well imagine the internal monologue driving this Parisian expedition. It must have been a relentless drumbeat of needing to prove her relevance, a burning desire to demonstrate that she could command the world's attention on her own terms, completely divorced from the royal institution she so publicly discarded. The sheer psychological weight of maintaining such a grandiose illusion must be terribly exhausting, requiring a level of hypervigilance where every gesture is calculated not for its authenticity, but for its potential currency in the morning headlines and social media feeds. Behind the breathless fashion commentary and the carefully curated online adoration, the reality of her stay at the Plaza Athénée was something altogether more contrived, resembling a fortified bunker of aggressive public relations rather than a luxurious holiday. Her team operated with the ruthless efficiency of a political campaign, enforcing strict non-disclosure agreements upon the hotel staff, dictating the precise angles from which photographers were permitted to shoot, and entirely sealing off any genuine, unscripted interaction with the outside world. A longtime family acquaintance has quietly noted that the atmosphere surrounding Meghan during these high-stakes public outings is often incredibly tense, characterized by a suffocating need for absolute control over every minute detail, from the ambient lighting in a room to the exact phrasing used by her spokespeople. It is a deeply cynical way to exist, essentially living life as a series of staged photo opportunities where the primary objective is to manufacture an aura of immense wealth and high fashion consequence, regardless of the actual underlying truth. The long-term consequence of relying so heavily on this iron-fisted image management is a profound hollowness. When you build an entire public persona on a foundation of meticulously suppressed realities, you inevitably leave yourself incredibly vulnerable to the slightest crack in the facade. And in a world where digital paper trails are practically indestructible, maintaining a perfect, impermeable silence around one's elaborate financial arrangements is nothing short of a fool's errand. The unraveling of this Parisian fantasy did not begin with a dramatic public confrontation or a scandalous paparazzi photograph, but rather with the quiet, devastating rebellion of a staff accountant deep within the administrative bowels of the hotel. Perhaps motivated by an exhaustion with the demanding entourage, or simply unnerved by the glaring discrepancies in the billing paperwork, this individual took it upon themselves to carefully scan the highly confidential invoices that were supposedly never meant to see the light of day. There is a profound irony in the fact that while Meghan was upstairs, draped in designer fabrics and projecting an image of effortless global dominance, the very administrative foundation of her stay was quietly being dismantled by someone armed with nothing more than a scanner and a sense of absolute indignation. These documents, stamped with digital time codes and laying bare every exorbitant charge from penthouse suites to staggering $3,200 stylist retainers, were silently transmitted to a respected French entertainment journalist, bypassing the fiercely guarded public relations machinery entirely. A well-placed source later confirmed that the sheer volume of these expenses, and more importantly, the bizarre manner in which they were routed and authorized, immediately raised massive red flags within European media circles. This was not the standard operating procedure for a supposedly independent humanitarian powerhouse. It bore all the hallmarks of a smoke and mirrors financial operation designed to obscure the true source of the funding, setting the stage for a spectacular, unpalatable collision with reality. The definitive death knell for the carefully constructed narrative of the Paris trip sounded not from the tabloid press, but from the fiercely protective halls of high fashion itself, arriving with a swiftness that was genuinely staggering. As whispers of the leaked invoices began to circulate, the assumption that Balenciaga was footing the bill, a rumor that had been allowed to subtly flourish, adding a desperately needed veneer of industry credibility to her appearance, was completely obliterated by the brand's own executives. When contacted by investigators attempting to untangle the complicated financial web, the luxury house issued a blunt, unequivocal denial, stating firmly and on the record that they did not sponsor her stay in any capacity whatsoever. This public rejection was a devastating hammer blow to her carefully curated image. For a woman whose entire post-royal brand is predicated on the illusion of being universally desired by top-tier global entities, being publicly disavowed by a major fashion house is an embarrassment of the absolute highest order. It fundamentally shifted the narrative from a story of a glamorous duchess conquering Paris Fashion Week to a rather unseemly tale of a former working royal allegedly padding her own mythology, allowing false assumptions of corporate sponsorship to persist in order to artificially inflate her own perceived market value. The long-term damage of such a stark repudiation cannot be overstated. The elite circles of fashion and philanthropy operate heavily on trust and genuine clout, and once a public figure is exposed as having manufactured their associations, the golden doors of the establishment begin to quietly yet firmly lock shut. As the undeniable reality of the Balenciaga statement and the leaked receipts began to thoroughly dominate the news cycle, the atmosphere within her immediate camp reportedly shifted from triumphant self-congratulation to a state of outright, palpable panic. A source behind closed doors described the emotional volatility of those crucial hours, suggesting that Meghan was visibly shaken, transitioning rapidly from the intoxicating high of the paparazzi flashes to the cold, suffocating dread of total exposure. One must consider the agonizing internal monologue of a woman who has spent years ruthlessly cultivating a flawless, victimized yet entirely triumphant persona, suddenly realizing that she is entirely unable to control a narrative that exposes the very mechanics of her self-promotion. The silence from her normally aggressive communications team was absolutely deafening, pointing to a frantic, disorganized scramble behind the scenes as highly paid advisors weighed the perilous options of issuing a denial that could be instantly disproven or remaining silent and allowing the scandalous financial details to fester in the public imagination. This catastrophic loss of narrative control is the ultimate nightmare for someone so deeply invested in managing their own mythology, representing a humiliating return to earth after a fiercely orchestrated flight of fancy. Ultimately, the Parisian debacle laid bare the fundamental tragedy of their current existence. Despite the titles, the proximity to historical wealth, and the endless attempts to rebrand, the relentless pursuit of unearned adoration invariably leaves a paper trail, and reality, no matter how aggressively managed, always has a way of presenting the final bill. When one actually takes the time to scrutinize the minutiae of these leaked invoices, the sheer scale of the financial discrepancy becomes impossible to ignore, painting a picture that is entirely at odds with the carefully broadcast narrative. We are not merely talking about a few lavish room service bills. These documents detailed staggering $3,200 stylist retainers, astronomical daily rates for penthouse accommodations at the Plaza Athénée, and an endless fleet of luxury, blacked-out vehicles stationed on perpetual standby. On the surface, her highly publicized foray into Paris Fashion Week was sold to the public as the triumphant return of a royal-adjacent global humanitarian, supposedly an invited guest of honor, basking in the glow of high-end European fashion. However, the private reality exposed by the paperwork revealed a convoluted web of bizarre authorization codes, mismatched booking dates, and most crucially, the glaring presence of third-party payers that completely dismantled the illusion of a prestigious corporate sponsorship. One must consider the exhausting mental gymnastics required to parade through the streets of Paris, soaking up the flashes of the paparazzi, all while knowing that the entire opulent spectacle is propped up by a precarious and hidden financial scaffolding that could collapse at any moment. The atmosphere of pressure surrounding such an endeavor must be positively suffocating, demanding a constant, hyper-vigilant performance to ensure the glittering facade never betrays the messy, transactional reality churning just beneath the surface. Ultimately, the long-term consequence of this specific brand of public deception is a permanent erosion of trust, cementing a reputation where every future charitable endeavor or red carpet appearance will be instantly met with profound cynicism and forensic financial scrutiny. As the irrefutable evidence of these financial discrepancies began to circulate freely across global media platforms, the immediate reaction from her famously aggressive public relations apparatus was a silence so profound and absolute that it practically echoed. Normally, this is a machinery that operates with hair-trigger sensitivity, instantly dispatching cease and desist letters, strategically leaking counter-narratives to friendly journalists, and deploying a barrage of highly manicured statements to forcefully reclaim the high ground at the slightest hint of criticism. Yet in the face of scanned, time-stamped receipts and Balenciaga's brutal public disavowal, the entire Sussex communications strategy simply ground to a devastating halt, exposing an operation that was utterly paralyzed by the indisputable nature of the leaked documents. One can only imagine the sheer, unadulterated panic that must have gripped her advisors during those frantic late-night strategy sessions as they watched their carefully constructed narrative of global dominance evaporate into a humiliating scandal of phantom sponsors and unpaid bills. Scheduled interviews were hastily pulled without any coherent explanation, and pre-planned promotional appearances tied to the Paris trip simply vanished from the calendar, a cowardly retreat that spoke volumes more than any polished press release ever could. To lose control of the narrative so spectacularly is the ultimate failure for a camp that trades entirely on the currency of managed perception, and the desperate scramble to wipe the digital fingerprints from this disaster only served to highlight the depth of their institutional panic. As the digital wildfire spread unchecked across every conceivable social media platform, the sheer weight of the public backlash created an external pressure cooker that was entirely impossible for the Sussex camp to mitigate or ignore. One must picture the suffocating atmosphere of a media cycle that has suddenly and rather ruthlessly turned against you, transforming what was meant to be a crowning sartorial achievement into an endless stream of digital mockery and forensic accounting. The public, long exhausted by their incessant demands for privacy coupled with their relentless thrusts into the limelight, seized upon these leaked invoices with a collective, cynical glee, dismantling the Duchess's carefully curated aura of modern grace line by line and euro by euro. For a public figure who thrives entirely on the oxygen of uncritical adoration and controlled narratives, watching ordinary citizens and seasoned journalists alike pull apart her financial scaffolding must have been an experience fraught with a deep, paralyzing anxiety. The internal realization that her carefully constructed shield of victimhood could not deflect the cold, hard reality of a stamped hotel receipt must have been a profoundly destabilizing moment, completely upending her standard operational playbook. The long-term consequence of this digital evisceration is a permanent shift in how the public consumes their brand. The days of blindly accepting their glossy, self-produced narratives are entirely over, replaced by a default setting of intense skepticism and a demand for verifiable proof. Within the sprawling confines of their Montecito estate, the fallout from this catastrophic Parisian misadventure created an atmosphere that has been described as nothing short of claustrophobic and intensely volatile. A source within the inner circle has quietly confirmed that the emotional turmoil behind those heavily guarded walls was staggering, characterized by frantic, tearful calculations as the undeniable reality set in that their most prized possession, absolute control over their public image, had been decisively wrested from their grasp. For Meghan, a woman who has spent the better part of a decade meticulously crafting a narrative of unassailable moral superiority, The sudden exposure of her transactional maneuvers must have felt like a profound and deeply personal violation. The internal monologue during those dark hours must have been a chaotic loop of blame, shock, and desperate strategic recalibration, as she was forced to confront the horrifying fact that the very public she sought to endlessly manipulate was now dissecting her financial receipts with a mixture of amusement and contempt. It is a desperately lonely position to occupy, realizing that the sycophantic praise of the Hollywood elite is entirely conditional, and that when the glittering facade cracks, the loyalty of those supposed friends evaporates faster than the morning mist. This profound loss of narrative control carries devastating long-term consequences, permanently altering the dynamic of her public existence from one of proactive, aggressive self-promotion to a constant, exhausting state of defensive paranoia. This relentless pressure to maintain the illusion of immense independent wealth and influence inevitably forces individuals into increasingly precarious and shadowy arrangements, which brings us to the most troubling revelation buried within those leaked hotel invoices. The true scandal was never really about the exorbitant cost of the penthouse suite or the frankly ridiculous stylist fees. Rather, the genuine intrigue lay entirely in the mysterious payment authorization codes that clearly pointed to a deeply hidden benefactor operating far beyond the glamorous lights of Paris. When a self-proclaimed global icon is forced to rely on convoluted financial routing through unnamed corporate entities just to fund a weekend of aggressive self-promotion, it fundamentally alters our understanding of their actual status and operational reality. The frantic attempts by her team to obscure the identity of this third-party payer only served to amplify the public's forensic interest, transforming a straightforward PR disaster into a sprawling digital whodunit that threatened to expose connections long kept hidden from the public eye. One cannot help but marvel at the sheer arrogance required to construct such a fragile, easily traceable house of cards, operating under the deeply flawed assumption that the global press would simply accept the Parisian fairy tale without ever bothering to look beneath the surface. It is a masterclass in hubris, demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of how the modern media landscape operates, and setting the stage for an even more explosive revelation that would soon send shockwaves through their already incredibly fragile marital dynamic. The relentless pressure to maintain the illusion of immense independent wealth and influence inevitably forces individuals into increasingly precarious and shadowy arrangements, which brings us to the most troubling revelation buried within those leaked hotel invoices. The true scandal, as it turned out, was never really about the exorbitant cost of the penthouse suite or the frankly ridiculous styling fees that had initially captured the public's rather cynical imagination. Rather, the genuine intrigue lay entirely in the mysterious payment authorization codes that clearly pointed to a deeply hidden benefactor operating far beyond the glamorous, flashing lights of the Parisian boulevards. When investigative journalists began to meticulously trace the digital breadcrumbs left by these offshore accounts and electronic signatures, a well-placed source confirmed that the financial trail bypassed all known corporate entities and charitable foundations associated with the Sussexes, leading directly to a highly wealthy, unnamed figure based in Los Angeles. This individual, swiftly dubbed Mr. X by the press, was not a new aristocratic acquaintance, but someone possessing deep roots in Meghan's pre-royal Hollywood social circles, fundamentally altering our understanding of her current operational reality. The frantic, entirely disorganized attempts by her team to obscure the identity of this third-party payer only served to amplify the public's forensic interest, transforming a straightforward public relations disaster into a sprawling, digital whodunit that threatened to expose alliances long kept purposefully hidden from the public eye. One must deeply consider the profound hypocrisy of a woman who has spent years aggressively marketing herself as a fiercely independent, self-made feminist powerhouse, only to be exposed as relying on the clandestine financial patronage of an old Hollywood connection to fund her aggressively publicized European reinventions. It is a masterclass in hubris, demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of how the modern media landscape operates and highlighting the sheer arrogance required to construct such a fragile, easily traceable house of cards. The implications of this financial arrangement are truly staggering, raising entirely valid questions regarding what exactly this wealthy benefactor expected in return for bankrolling a global vanity tour masked as a triumphant fashion comeback. A source within the inner circle noted that as the media began to successfully connect the dots between the leaked Paris receipts and this historical Los Angeles associate, the atmosphere within her camp shifted from standard defensive panic to a state of absolute, unmitigated terror. The realization that her carefully constructed shield of victimhood could not deflect the cold, hard reality of a stamped hotel receipt tied to a shadow sponsor must have been a profoundly destabilizing moment, completely upending her standard operational playbook. Ultimately, it exposed the deeply cynical, transactional nature of her post-royal existence, where loyalty and prestige are seemingly outsourced to the highest bidder behind tightly closed doors. As the scandalous reality of Mr. X completely saturated the global news cycle, the focus inevitably shifted toward the deeply humiliating position in which this placed her seemingly oblivious husband, Prince Harry. For a man who has made a highly publicized, entirely exhausting cottage industry out of demanding publicly funded security, endlessly citing the profound, supposedly unique dangers his family faces, the revelation that his wife was secretly utilizing the private funds of a shadow benefactor for luxury excursions is nothing short of catastrophic. A source behind closed doors has painted a remarkably bleak picture of the prince's reaction, describing a man utterly blindsided by the media reports, having ostensibly believed that the Parisian venture was a fully sanctioned, above-board corporate arrangement. The psychological pressure of realizing that he is so thoroughly disconnected from the financial machinations of his own wife must be absolutely immense, forcing him to confront the deeply uncomfortable possibility that he is no longer an equal partner, but rather a peripheral figure in her relentless pursuit of solo relevance. It is a desperately sad juxtaposition. A former working royal fiercely battling the British government over security provisions, while entirely unaware that a wealthy Los Angeles associate is quietly picking up the tab for his wife's five-star European posturing. The fallout within the sprawling confines of their Montecito estate reportedly created an atmosphere that was intensely volatile, shattering whatever fragile, united front the couple had managed to project in recent months. One can only imagine the furious, deeply painful conversations echoing through those halls as Harry was forced to reconcile the public embarrassment of the leaks with the profound, private betrayal of having been kept entirely in the dark regarding the Mr. X arrangement. A longtime family acquaintance has suggested that this specific incident has fundamentally altered the power dynamic of their marriage, stripping away the lingering illusion of a shared strategic vision and replacing it with a cold, hard reality of compartmentalized secrets and separate agendas. For Harry, the realization that he is effectively out of the loop regarding his wife's aggressive public relations maneuvers must be a bitter pill to swallow, particularly given how much of his own family, reputation, and homeland he has sacrificed on the altar of their supposedly unified brand. The long-term consequences of such a glaring breach of trust cannot be easily repaired by a heavily staged paparazzi walk or a carefully worded statement. It leaves a permanent, highly visible fracture in the foundation of their partnership, visible to anyone willing to look past the heavily manicured surface. When one zooms out to examine the broader trajectory of this rather exhausting saga, the Mr. X revelation serves as a definitive turning point, confirming the worst suspicions of their most ardent critics and alienating whatever establishment support they had managed to retain. Elite Hollywood and philanthropic circles, which operate heavily on the currency of discretion, trust, and perceived authenticity, have predictably begun to distance themselves from a brand so fundamentally tainted by financial opacity and endless drama. It is a profound, entirely self-inflicted isolation, born from a relentless, insatiable desire to command the global stage without possessing the necessary substance or transparency to sustain it. The chilling of potential partnerships and the quiet withdrawal of high society invitations are merely the immediate symptoms of a much deeper, likely terminal decline in their cultural capital, as former allies suddenly realize the sheer reputational risk of associating with such an incredibly volatile operation. In the end, the Parisian facade did not merely crack. It entirely collapsed under the weight of its own deception, leaving behind a profoundly compromised couple, a deeply embarrassed prince, and a paper trail that will undoubtedly follow them for the rest of their highly publicized days.